They say the people who love you most are the ones capable of telling the most catastrophic lies. I used to think a lie was just a spoken untruth, a momentary lapse in honesty meant to save face or spare a fleeting feeling. But feeling the rough, worn edges of a small, navy blue booklet that should have been thousands of miles away, I finally understood the terrifying truth. Some lies aren't spoken. They are entire lives, carefully constructed over decades, built with brick and mortar specifically to keep you from screaming. For 22 years, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where I came from. I was Chloe Vance, daughter of Helen Vance, the rigid, pragmatic, unyielding town clerk of Oakhaven. Oakhaven wasn't much of a town, really. It was more of a feudal estate masquerading as a municipality entirely owned and operated by Sterling Agrochemicals. You either worked for Sterling or you serviced the people who worked for Sterling. And above it all sat Richard Sterling, the silver-haired, benevolent billionaire who kept our little coastal town alive while quietly, meticulously bleeding it dry. Growing up, my mother, Helen, was an impenetrable fortress. She was the woman who never smiled in family photos. The woman who worked 70-hour weeks and locked herself in our dimly lit home office every single weekend. When the scandal broke last month, when the anonymous leaked documents painted her as the ultimate corrupt official, the woman who supposedly took millions in offshore bribes to rubber stamp Sterling's toxic waste permits, the whole town bought it without a second thought. They threw red paint on our porch. They spat at my car in the grocery store parking lot. It was too easy for them to believe that the cold, detached Helen Vance was a monster who sold out her neighbor's health for a secret fortune. But I knew her. I knew the way she meticulously saved grocery coupons, the way her hands trembled when she worried about the winter heating bill. A woman sitting on millions of dirty dollars doesn't cry in the kitchen at 2 a.m. over a broken washing machine. I wasn't alone in this nightmare. I had Tyler. Tyler and I had been inseparable since we were kids with scraped knees, building forts in the toxic ash-covered woods near the plant's perimeter fence. We were bonded by a shared unspoken sense of alienation. If my mother was the town's newly minted villain, Tyler's father, Arthur, was its long-forgotten ghost. Arthur used to be a brilliant, fiery inspector for the Environmental Protection Agency. I remember him from my childhood as a giant of a man who used to carry Tyler on his shoulders, a man whose booming laugh filled the room as he told us stories about saving the oceans. But over the last 10 years, Arthur had withered into a paranoid, chain-smoking recluse who jumped at shadows, triple-locked his doors, and refused to leave his house. Tyler always thought his dad just cracked under the pressure of a demanding job. We didn't know then that our parents' shattered lives were two sides of the exact same bloody coin. Before the darkness swallowed our families whole, there was Aunt Sarah. Sarah was my mother's younger sister, and she was everything my mother wasn't: radiant, spontaneous, and wildly unapologetic. She used to sneak me out for ice cream before dinner and teach me how to paint with watercolors on the porch. And then, right after my 7th birthday, she was just gone. The official story, the one my mother repeated with mechanical, dead-eyed precision any time I dared to ask, was that Sarah had fallen in love with a French photographer, moved to Europe, and decided she wanted a clean break from Oakhaven. I spent my entire adolescence hating Sarah for abandoning us, for never sending so much as a postcard while my mother retreated further into her icy shell. Now, with the town screaming for my mother's head and Tyler struggling to keep his father from completely losing his grip on reality, we were pushed to the absolute edge. We were two kids armed with nothing but desperate denial, trying to fight a multi-billion-dollar empire that literally owned the ground we walked on. The world told us to give up, to accept the disgrace, pack our bags, and leave town in the dead of night. But Tyler and I, we don't give up. The more they pushed us, the more I realized that my mother's stoicism wasn't coldness, it was terror. And to prove it, to find the crack in the facade, I knew I had to look in the one place she explicitly forbade me from ever going near, her old rusted safety deposit box at the First National Bank downtown. The sky over Oakhaven was the color of bruised iron the morning I decided to commit a felony. I sat in the passenger seat of Tyler's rusted 1998 Ford Bronco, the heater blasting a smell of dust and burnt oil into the damp air. Tyler's hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were stark white. He hadn't slept. I could tell by the dark, purplish bags under his eyes and the manic energy vibrating off him. "He didn't just snap, Chloe," Tyler whispered, his voice cracking. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a battered leather briefcase. It looked like it had been buried and dug back up, my dad. I found this hidden in the crawl space under the floorboards. He didn't lose his mind. They dismantled him. He dumped a mountain of yellowed papers, legal summons, and printed emails onto my lap. I sifted through them, my breath catching in my throat. They were EPA reports. Drafts of violation notices dating back 12 years, detailing illegal chemical dumping by Sterling Agrochemicals right into the groundwater supply. But there were other papers, too. Dozens of lawsuits filed against Arthur by a phalanx of high-powered corporate law firms. They accused him of extortion, of falsifying data, of corporate espionage. There were letters threatening to take his pension, his house, and his custody of Tyler. He was going to blow the whistle, Tyler said, tears finally spilling over his lower lashes. Sterling didn't just fire him. They unleashed an army of suits who bled him dry in court for 3 years until he had nothing left. They followed him. They tapped his phones. They broke into our house and left dead animals on our kitchen counter just to make him look crazy when he called the cops. They tortured him until his mind gave out. A cold, heavy stone dropped into my stomach. If Sterling was capable of systematically destroying a federal agent just to cover up a leak, what the hell had he done to my mother? I needed to know. The key to her safety deposit box is small. Intricate piece of brass I'd swiped from the false bottom of her jewelry box was burning a hole in my pocket. Getting into the First National Bank was supposed to be the hard part, but Oakhaven was a town built on pity and gossip. The bank manager, Mrs. Gable, had known me since I was in diapers. When I walked in, eyes downcast, playing the part of the disgraced, heartbroken daughter just trying to retrieve some family heirlooms before the state froze our assets, her pity overrode her professionalism. She let me into the vault without checking the master logs. The vault was freezing, smelling of old paper, dust, and secrets. I found box 402. My hand shook so violently I dropped the key twice before finally sliding it into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. I pulled the long metal drawer out and carried it to the private viewing booth. I don't know what I expected. Neatly stacked bundles of $100 bills? Offshore bank account ledgers? Diamonds bought with blood money? I took a deep breath, preparing myself to face the undeniable proof of my mother's corruption. I opened the lid. There was no money, no offshore accounts. The box was entirely empty, except for a small clear plastic bag. Inside the bag lay a vintage microcassette tape and a small navy blue booklet. My brow furrowed in confusion. I picked up the booklet, tracing the gold foil lettering on the front. United States of America passport. I flipped it open, and the breath was completely violently knocked out of my lungs. Smiling back at me from the laminated photo page was Aunt Sarah. It was issued 12 years ago. But that wasn't what made the room spin. It was the expiration date, the blank visa pages, the pristine condition of the paper. You cannot travel to Europe, build a new life, and disappear into the French countryside without a passport. It was the one piece of identification she would have absolutely needed. She never left Oakhaven. Panic, cold and sharp as a razor, sliced through my veins. I shoved the passport and the tape into my jacket, slammed the box shut, and practically ran out of the bank. I threw myself back into Tyler's car. Drive, just drive. Go anywhere, I gasped. We drove out to the abandoned quarry, the rain hammering against the windshield. I pulled an old bulky dictaphone out of Tyler's glove box, a relic from his dad's investigative days that Tyler kept for spare parts. With trembling fingers, I slid the microcassette in and pressed play. For a moment, there was just the hiss of static, then a voice. Smooth, calm, dripping with aristocratic honey and terrifying politeness. It was Richard Sterling. "Helen, please. Look at me," the voice purred from the tiny speaker. "There is no need for these hysterics. The permits are a formality. You send the paper, the town keeps its jobs, and everyone is happy." Then my mother's voice. But it wasn't the cold, stoic woman I knew. She was sobbing. A raw, guttural sound of pure agony. "Where is she? What did you do to my sister, Richard?" "You promised me. You said if I fixed the zoning files." "And you did wonderfully, Helen," Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "But Sarah was nosy, just like Arthur. She found things she shouldn't have near the drainage pipes. Now, I can assure you, Sarah is no longer a problem. And as long as you continue to be the pragmatic, cooperative clerk we so value in Oakhaven, your lovely daughter Chloe will never have to find out what happens to nosy girls. Are we clear? A heavy, suffocating silence followed on the tape, broken only by my mother's quiet, defeated weeping. Then the click of the recording ending. In the car, the silence was deafening. I stared at the tape player, the world I knew dissolving into ash around me. My mother wasn't a corrupt villain hoarding millions. She was a hostage. For 12 years, she'd worn a mask of ice, taking the town's hatred, signing away her soul. Purely to keep me alive, Sterling hadn't just bribed her. He had murdered my aunt to force her compliance. And now, Tyler and I held the only physical proof of a murder covered up by a billionaire. I looked up at Tyler. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of dawning horror and burning rage. We weren't just two kids trying to clear our parents' names anymore. We were holding a ticking bomb. The silence in the car was suddenly broken by the rhythmic, aggressive hammering of the rain against the metal roof. For a fleeting euphoric second, a wild spark of hope ignited in my chest. We had it. We had the silver bullet. This tiny plastic rectangle held the power to exonerate my mother, to vindicate Tyler's father, and to watch Richard Sterling's golden empire crumble into ash. All we had to do was get this tape to the FBI in the city, far away from the poisoned roots of Oakhaven. I have to tell her, I choked out, the words tumbling over each other. Tyler, I have to go to my mother. I spent the last 10 years looking at her like she was a monster. Every time I rolled my eyes, every time I slammed my bedroom door, she was swallowing poison to keep me breathing. I have to tell her we know. We can pack a bag, grab your dad, and just drive until we hit a federal building. Tyler didn't hesitate. He shoved the Bronco into gear, the tires spinning and spitting mud as we tore out of the quarry. The drive back into town felt agonizingly slow, even though Tyler was pushing 80 down the slick, winding county roads. My heart was a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I pictured my mother's face, how the hardened, weary lines around her eyes would finally soften when she realized the burden was lifted. I imagined hugging her, really hugging her, for the first time since I was 7 years old. But Oakhaven has a funny way of suffocating hope before it can even take its first breath. As we turned onto Elm Street, my stomach plummeted into my shoes. There were no police sirens, no flashing lights to warn us. Just a chilling, unnatural stillness. Halfway down the block, parked at a crooked angle on the meticulously manicured lawn of my childhood home, was a massive, black SUV with tinted windows. "Tyler, stop the car," I hissed, panic seizing my throat. "Turn off the headlights." He killed the lights and pulled into the shadowy driveway of a vacant neighbor's house. We sat in the suffocating darkness, peering through the rain-streaked windshield. The front door of my house, the heavy oak door my mother locked religiously every night at 9 o'clock, was wide open, swaying slightly in the storm. The porch light was smashed. "Stay here," Tyler whispered, reaching under his seat to pull out a heavy metal tire iron. "Lock the doors." "Are you insane?" "I'm not letting you go in there alone," I shot back, my voice trembling but my grip on the door handle ironclad. I tucked the tape and the passport deep into the inner pocket of my damp jacket and followed him out into the freezing rain. We crept across the soaked lawn, our sneakers making soft, squelching sounds. The closer we got, the more the reality of the nightmare settled over me. The living room window was shattered. Inside, the house looked as though a hurricane had torn through it. The floral couch was slashed open, stuffing spilling out like guts. Bookshelves were tipped over, picture frames ground into the hardwood floor. "Mom," I screamed, abandoning all caution as I sprinted through the hallway. "Mom, where are you?" The silence that answered me was heavier than the grave. I ran into the kitchen, slipping on a puddle of smashed ceramic from her favorite teacups. And then I saw it. Her home office, the locked sanctuary she never let anyone enter, was utterly decimated. But it wasn't a random burglary. The heavy oak desk had been shoved aside, and the floorboards underneath had been violently pried up, exposing a dark, hollow cavity in the foundation. They had been looking for something specific. They had been looking for the tape. Suddenly, a blinding white light flooded the room, pinning us like insects under a microscope. Tyler spun around, raising the tire iron, but it was useless. Standing in the doorway were two men in perfectly tailored charcoal gray suits, completely dry despite the storm outside. One of them held a high-powered flashlight. The other held a silenced pistol, resting casually against his thigh. But it wasn't the gun that made my knees give out. It was the man stepping out from behind them. Richard Sterling looked exactly as he did on the charity gala billboards scattered around town. Silver hair perfectly swept back, a cashmere coat draped over his shoulders, and a smile so warm and paternal it made my blood run cold. "Chloe, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice a smooth, rich baritone that echoed off the ruined walls of my home. "You have no idea how disappointed I am. I had such a lovely, mutually beneficial arrangement with your mother. She was a very pragmatic woman, but you had to go to the bank." "Where is she?" I screamed, the sound tearing at my vocal cords. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror streamed down my face. "What did you do to her?" Sterling sighed, a slow, mournful sound as if I were a child who had just tracked mud onto a clean rug. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single silver hoop earring, my mother's earring. The one she never took off. He tossed it onto the ruined floorboards. It hit the wood with a hollow metallic pang that echoed in my skull. "Your mother is currently taking a tour of the new reinforced concrete foundation we're laying at the Section 4 drainage facility," Sterling said softly, his eyes locking onto mine with the dead, black emptiness of a shark. "It's scheduled to be filled in exactly 1 hour. It would be a terrible shame if she happened to be standing in the blast zone when the cement trucks arrive." He took a step forward, the man with the gun raising it slightly, pointing it directly at Tyler's chest. "I believe you withdrew something that belongs to me from box 402, Chloe," Sterling purred, extending a manicured hand. "Hand over the tape and Sarah's passport. If you do, I'll let you and your little boyfriend walk out of this town tonight. If you don't, well, Arthur will lose a son and Helen will become a permanent part of Oakhaven's infrastructure." My chest heaved as I looked from the gun aimed at Tyler's heart, to the silver earring on the floor, and finally to the outstretched hand of the man who had murdered my aunt. The tape burned against my ribs. If I gave it to him, my mother's name would forever be dragged through the mud and Sterling would remain untouchable. But if I didn't, my mother would die in the exact same toxic dirt as her sister, and Tyler would be shot right in front of me. We were completely, utterly trapped. The air in the room was so thick with tension I could taste the metallic tang of fear on my tongue. I stared at the man with the gun aimed at Tyler's heart, then back at Richard Sterling's outstretched hand. That hand had signed the checks that built this town, and it had almost certainly signed the order to kill my aunt. "Decide, Chloe," Sterling urged, his voice dropping to a seductive, grandfatherly purr. "Every second you waste is another inch of concrete pouring around your mother's ankles. Think of her, think of Tyler. All I want is peace, sweetheart. Let's not let any more Vances vanish from Oakhaven." I looked at Tyler. He was vibrating with a terrifying mix of terror and suicidal fury. He knew that even if I gave Sterling the tape, we were likely dead. But if I didn't, my mother was gone in a matter of minutes. My trembling hand slowly moved inside my jacket. My fingers brushed the smooth plastic of the microcassette, the definitive proof of Richard Sterling's criminality. Then I touched the worn cover of Aunt Sarah's passport, the symbol of everything she'd lost. I had to do it. I couldn't let him murder my mother, too. "Okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain beating against the shattered windows. "Okay, I'll give it to you." A look of smug, predatory satisfaction bloomed on Sterling's face. Tyler made a guttural sound in his throat, a protest that died before it could become words. The goon with the gun shifted his grip, a moment of distraction. I pulled my hand out of my jacket. In one motion, I threw the navy blue passport to the ground at Sterling's feet. He instinctively flinched, looking down at the booklet. That was the only opening we were going to get. "Tyler, now!" I screamed. Tyler didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy tire iron with a primal roar, not at the gunman, but at the large, high-powered flashlight one of them was holding. Smash! The light exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. Total, suffocating darkness swallowed the room. "Get them!" Sterling's voice, stripped of all its charm, roared through the gloom. I heard the heavy thud of bodies colliding, the scraping of furniture, a pained grunt from Tyler. In the dark, I couldn't see anything. I threw myself to the floor, crawling on my hands and knees across the glass and debris, heading toward the doorway of my mother's office. Suddenly, a massive hand grabbed the collar of my jacket, yanking me backward. I was pulled up against a hard, broad chest. "I have her," one of the goons shouted. "Take her to the SUV." Sterling commanded. "Forget the boy." If she tries to fight, shoot her. The grip on my collar tightened, choking me. I was being dragged out of my own home through the rain toward the waiting black behemoth. Behind me, I heard Tyler shouting my name, but his voice was drowned out by the thunder and the powerful roar of the SUV's engines starting up. They shoved me into the back seat of the SUV. Richard Sterling climbed in next to me, bringing the smell of expensive cologne and damp wool with him. The goon with the gun sat in the passenger seat, his weapon trained on me through the dark. "A drainage facility, Section 4, Sterling said to the driver, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Tell the foreman we're on a tight schedule. We need that pour finished before sunrise." He turned to me, the faint dashboard lights reflecting in his cold, calculating eyes. He reached over and violently ripped my jacket open, pulling the microcassette from my inner pocket. He holding it up, inspecting it with a triumphant curl of his lip. "You are so very like your mother, Chloe," Sterling said, pocketing the tape. "Full of fire, full of misplaced conviction, and ultimately just as helpless. You thought you could fight me in my own town?" I sat slumped against the leather seat, the hot tears finally stinging my eyes. I had tried to be a hero. I had tried to save everyone. And now I had not only given him the evidence, but I was being driven straight to the spot where I would watch my mother die before they killed me too. As the SUV sped down the winding, rain-slicked back roads of Oakhaven, my hand brushed against something small, round, and cold lying on the floor mat. I looked down. It was my mother's silver hoop earring. They must have lost it when they dragged her from the house earlier. I picked it up, my fingers closing tightly around the small, metallic circle until it cut into my skin. We were 10 minutes away from the facility. 10 minutes until the cement arrived. And then, as if in a terrible dream, I heard them. Not a storm, but sirens. A chorus of them, growing louder and closer with every second. But they weren't the distinct, high-pitched wail of the Oakhaven local police. These were deep, throbbing state police sirens. Tyler had escaped. The wail of the sirens didn't just break the silence. It shattered the entire reality Richard Sterling had so carefully constructed. The rhythmic flashing of red and blue lights began to bounce off the rain-streaked windows of the SUV, painting Sterling's pale, aristocratic face in violent, frantic strokes. "Step on it? Get us into the facility now." Sterling barked, his calm, grandfatherly facade completely disintegrating into the raw, feral panic of a cornered animal. The driver slammed his foot on the gas. The heavy SUV fishtailed on the muddy access road, tearing through a chain-link fence with a horrific screech of twisting metal. We skidded into the heart of the Section 4 drainage site. The scene was ripped straight from a nightmare. Massive, monolithic cement trucks idled in the torrential downpour, their drums slowly rotating with a low, bone-rattling hum. Powerful industrial floodlights cut through the sheets of rain, illuminating a massive, rectangular pit reinforced with a grid of fixed steel rebar. And there, kneeling in the freezing mud at the very edge of the abyss, her hands bound behind her back with thick industrial zip ties, was my mother. "Mom," I screamed, thrashing against the car door, but the goon beside me grabbed my hair, slamming me back against the leather seat. But Sterling had run out of time. The state police cruisers poured through the torn fence like a mechanized cavalry, completely surrounding the SUV and the cement trucks. Doors flew open and a dozen officers stepped out into the storm, weapons drawn, their voices booming over bullhorns, ordering everyone to the ground. Sterling didn't run. He adjusted his cashmere coat, took a slow, deep breath to compose himself, and stepped out of the vehicle, raising his hands in a gesture of exaggerated innocence. He played the part of the bewildered billionaire perfectly. "Officers, please, there is a terrible misunderstanding here," Sterling called out over the rain, his voice dripping with practiced authority. "I am Richard Sterling. We caught this young woman trespassing on a dangerous construction site. I was merely bringing her to safety." A state police captain stepped forward, his expression hard as granite. "Save it, Mr. Sterling. We received a call about an abduction and an attempted murder. We know about the tape." Sterling chuckled a dark, patronizing sound. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the microcassette he had taken from me in the car. "You mean this tape? The ramblings of a disgruntled, mentally ill former employee? You're welcome to it, Captain. It proves absolutely nothing. You're right, Richard. That one doesn't." The voice cut through the noise of the idling engines and the pounding rain. I pushed past the goons, stumbling out of the SUV and gasped. Standing next to the captain, soaked to the bone, his face bruised and bleeding but his eyes burning with a triumphant, righteous fire, was Tyler. In his hand, he held the real microcassette. When I had thrown the passport to the floor and screamed for Tyler to smash the lights, I didn't just drop to the ground. In those 3 seconds of pure, chaotic darkness, I had shoved the real tape into Tyler's hands. The cassette Sterling had so violently ripped from my jacket pocket, the one he was now holding up like a trophy, was nothing but a blank, spare tape I had grabbed from Arthur's old dictaphone in the glove box. I watched the exact moment Richard Sterling's empire died. The smug, untouchable grin slid off his face, replaced by a slack-jawed, hollow realization that he had been outplayed by 2 kids he viewed as collateral damage. As the officers moved in, slapping cold steel handcuffs over his wrists and reading him his rights, he didn't say another word. He just stared at the mud. I didn't wait to see them put him in the back of the cruiser. I was already sprinting toward the pit. I dropped to my knees in the freezing slush, my hands frantically tearing at the thick plastic zip ties binding my mother's wrists. One of the officers rushed over with a pocket knife, slicing the thick bands. My mother collapsed forward into my arms. She was freezing, her clothes soaked, her meticulously kept hair plastered to her face. But as I pulled her against my chest, feeling the frantic, hammering beat of her heart against mine, the fortress of ice she had lived inside for 12 years finally spectacularly shattered. She let out a sob that seemed to tear its way up from the very bottom of her soul. She wrapped her arms around me so tightly it ached, burying her face in my shoulder. "I'm sorry," she wept, her voice raw and broken. "Chloe, my baby, I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you. I wanted to protect you." "I know, Mom, I know everything," I cried, burying my face in her wet hair, the rain mixing with my tears. "You did protect me, you saved me, and now you're safe. We're both safe." Sitting there in the mud of a toxic wasteland, surrounded by police sirens and the flashing red and blue lights that signaled the end of our nightmare, I had never felt warmer. That was 6 months ago. The fallout was biblical. The tape didn't just bring down Richard Sterling. It exposed a rot so deep it dismantled the entire corporate structure of Sterling Agrochemicals. The EPA swooped in, federal indictments were handed down like flyers, and the town of Oakhaven woke up from its 12-year coma. Tyler's dad, Arthur, is getting his life back. With his name fully cleared and a massive settlement from the wrongful termination lawsuits, the paranoid ghosts that haunted his house are slowly fading. Tyler looks lighter now, the crushing weight of his father's unmerited disgrace finally lifted from his shoulders. And my mother? She quit her job at the clerk's office. The townspeople who had thrown paint at our house and spat at us in the streets tried to apologize, leaving casseroles and cards on our front porch. My mother politely threw every single one of them in the trash. She didn't need their forgiveness, and she certainly didn't need their pity. Yesterday morning, I walked into our kitchen. The sun was streaming through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. My mother was standing at the stove, making pancakes. When she turned to look at me, the deep, exhausted lines around her eyes were gone. And for the first time in my entire adult life, I saw her smile a real, genuine, radiant smile. I used to think that love meant warmth, that it was all hugs and soft words. But the truth is, the most profound act of love I will ever know was a cold shoulder. It was a woman who let her only daughter hate her, who wore a mask of absolute villainy just to keep the monsters from looking my way. We lost Aunt Sarah. We lost 12 years to a lie. But looking at my mother now, seeing the light finally return to her eyes, I know one thing for certain: we survived. And we are never letting go of each other again.